course, one of the biggest conflicts of interest you could think of. But
I'll cut you off, don't worry.
yeah. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Always hard to follow lunch because everybody is getting ready for their lunch nap. But hopefully, I can keep you awake for a little longer. And the topic today is: does digital gameplay affect child well-being? And another way of saying that is: are we hurting our children when we let them play on iPads? Right? This is something that's on a lot of parents' minds. It's on our minds. I'm a parent. Bruce is a parent. Some of the other researchers here were parents, and so when we got the opportunity to collaborate with others in Sheffield and in Australia on a study to investigate what actually happens when people play digital games on tablets, we were very excited to do that with funding by the Lego Foundation, which has a larger initiative called Responsible Innovation in Technology for Children, which aims at this very question: don't we as an industry of game developers and game designers have a responsibility to think about what games do to the children who play them, rather than just think about profit? And so this is a report of a portion of this project, the RightTech project, which is in collaboration with the game industry. There are several partners in the game industry who are very interested in this question, and that is a delight to see. So the first part, the whole objective for RightTech is to understand how digital play can support well-being in children, and to develop guidelines for businesses and governments to put child well-being at the center of digital design. And the first part asked the question, the first phase of the study asked the question: what is well-being? It's a very ill-defined, multi-dimensional construct, and to create a well-being framework, and if you're interested in that, there's a report out by UNICEF, which is also a partner in this, that lays out how this well-being construct was defined and what the outcome of that will be. And the next phases of the project are to validate that framework, at least parts of it, and that's where we come in with the phase 2 study. And in our phase 2, we had 3 different portions or parts of that study. The first one was playtesting research, because we wanted to use games, but we wanted to decide which games to use for the study. The next one was a parent survey, and we wanted to know what parent attitudes toward digital gameplay were and how that affected what their children were allowed to do. And then the third one was an experimental research study, an intervention study conducted in the United States, Chile, and South Africa. So let's talk briefly about the playtesting. Before I certainly go in and run an international study over multiple weeks, I would really want to know whether the games that I pick for that have any chance of having any effect on well-being, right? So going in, that was kind of our insurance to say, let's do some playtesting research, let's see, and that was the question, whether casual games may provide experiences that have the potential to enhance child well-being. So we would never make any strong claims about it afterwards, but if we saw counter indicators, we might remove the game from the study. And so we were looking at in-game events which can be associated with well-being, different dimensions of well-being, and the ones that we picked are competence, agency, and relatedness, and those who are in the motivational psychology space will know that that's self-determination theory. And we also added curiosity, optimism, and relaxation to that as some more basic ideas of responses that kids have. And we had 25 participants. That was in New York City last summer. Average age was 11. They played games for 20 minutes, and there were 6 games, but they didn't play them all. And the methods that we used were player observations, video coding, interviews, and surveys. And so what we did is we had a survey up front where we asked them about their demographics and then their gameplay preferences. And then they played 2 games on a tablet, one each for 20 minutes. And then during the gameplay, we recorded the screen and we recorded their utterances. And we had an observation protocol where our researchers used in 5-minute increments, wrote down a number of indicators of what they saw in terms of gameplay. And then we had an interview afterwards. So we coded all of that along the 6 well-being dimensions. So we had what they said, what they played, what the observations were, what the interviews were, and what the surveys gave us as responses. And what we created are these, what we call well-being profiles of games. And there are matrices that have, as you see, competence, autonomy, and so on, those dimensions in each column, and then the observations of the individual players in each row. And the more indications we saw for well-being, the darker the shade of green in this case, right? So you see that the first game, which was Lego Tower, had, and I should have mentioned the games, as you saw them over here, Plants vs. Zombies, Rocket League Sideswipe, Lego Tower, Angry Birds, World of Goo, and Lego Builder's Journey were the games that were included. For a number of reasons, they all met criteria. For instance, they needed to be played on the tablet. In South Africa, we knew we were going to go into townships where there was no internet, so they couldn't rely on internet. They needed to have multiple language support, etc. No in-game purchases, etc. So so here are the results. Autonomy and agency was especially strong in Lego Tower, but there was also competence, but a little less so indications for optimism and positive outlook on life. Versus Lego Builder's Journey, we saw more indication for competence and some autonomy. So different games have different profiles. And of course, one wouldn't expect from every game that they hit every single category of well-being, but we wanted to make sure that there weren't some categories where we saw contraindications. And so we were very pleased with the results and included all 6 games into the actual study. Before I go into that though, I want to briefly talk about parents, because the parent attitudes and actions were something that really interested us, especially since nowadays a lot of parents are gamers themselves. And so our question was, what do gamer parents do with their children? And how does parental engagement with children's digital gameplay relate to well-being, and how would parents describe the potential? So we could only have them speculate, right? We couldn't actually have them give us conclusions. And so we had 351 participants of parents who were parents of 8 to 12-year-olds in North America. And we looked at beliefs and attitudes and mediation styles, what they do, to what extent they allow their children to play, but also their own gaming habits. And then some interviews to follow up. And what we found is, one thing is not all that surprising, the younger the children, the more co-play of parents and children. So the older they get, the less the parents are either allowed to play, could be in my kid's case, because I'm apparently not good enough to be on the team, or parents are not interested in playing as much with them anymore either. But we gave them a score of parent engagement related to video games, and here you see on the right side that on top, the blue graph, those are the gamer parents, and they are more engaged with their children on a number of different dimensions, asking them about the game, co-playing the game, selecting the game, even knowing what games they're playing, etc., than the non-gamer parents. The other thing that we found, not surprisingly, is that parent attitudes about gaming overall also is related to their belief that games can have a positive impact on child well-being. So more positive attitude means toward gameplay overall means that they have a more positive belief that there could be an impact on well-being. That's on the left. And on the right side, the more engaged a parent is with their child's well-being gaming, the more likely they are to believe that games have a positive impact. But what's interesting in both cases is that the yellow dots are the gamers. And so they have higher beliefs in the positive impact on gaming, on well-being, and generally speaking, higher attitudes about gaming, better attitudes about gaming, and are more engaged with their children when it comes to gameplay. What is interesting though, in the interviews, we got responses from parents about pain points in games. And I'm only pulling out one. This is all preliminary because we're still analyzing. But there is a complaint that games don't support an asymmetrical gameplay of one more experienced and one less experienced player, no matter which way that actually goes. In some cases goes that the parent isn't as experienced in playing and the child is stronger. But in other cases, on the right side, the gamer dad, 31 years old, says a lot of games will have multiplayer, but they're pitting against each other. Well, I'm going to smoke my 9-year-old most games we play. That's not fun for him or for me. And that has, or my son would smoke me, right? So the question is then, how can we have games that would actually support that and still give each of the players a satisfying role in the game? So those are some of the recommendations we got out of the parental surveys, but the most interesting thing was the difference between gamer parents and non-gamer parents. Where gamer parents were not more permissive, they were much more selective what their kids could play. The final part of our work in this research grant was to do experimental research. Now we wanted to actually look into the effect of digital play on well-being. And we asked whether digital gameplay over the course of 8 weeks enhanced well-being in players 8 to 12 years of age, and looking at variables that may moderate effects like that, and also looked at not so much cultural differences as much as does this actually hold across different cultures? Because trying to compare countries, as you know, is very difficult But to say, are there differences in general when we replicate that study in different countries was of interest. We were also interested in the question whether digital gameplay, whether social interactions emerge during play. For those of you who have played the games, you may have noticed none of them are multiplayer games. They're also all individual games. One of the reasons was we didn't have reliable internet access in the schools and we couldn't build an own network there. So it couldn't be a game that required a server. But what social interactions emerged nevertheless? And then is there a relationship between child well-being and their reported digital gameplay habits? So it was an experimental design with pre-test and post-test and inactive controls. And we also had behavior observation during play. So the researchers were in the room when the children were playing and were observing what was going on. And so here's a New York City research study, or kind of outside of New York City. This was in South Africa, in a township near or in Cape Town. And this is in Chile, one of the schools. So overall, we had 62 participants in New York City, 103 in South Africa, and 70 in Chile, all roughly this age group. And even though it was at different times, the gameplay was roughly over a 10 to 11 week time period where they had 1 to 2 sessions a week. So there were some differences in the different countries. And the games that were used were, by all of them, were Rocket League, Sideswipe, Angry Birds, Lego Power, and Plants vs. Zombies. And then you see there's some other games that we listed because, as it turns out, when you have gameplay like this over 10 weeks, kids do want to play something else, so we added more games to the mix. And those differed across countries for a number of reasons. This was the study design. The first visit involved a pre-test and a background survey, demographics, etc., gameplay habits, parental rules, mediation rules. And then the control group did nothing. In fact, many control groups did other after-school programs. So it's not like they didn't do anything, but they weren't part of the play visits. And for the other groups, there were play visits where the research assistants recorded the observations and where they had surveys during the gameplay about their experience, etc. And then for the final visit, we did a post-test with additional questions and interviews for the players, and then, of course, the parent survey that I talked about. We looked at 2 types of outcomes, proximal and distal. The proximal outcomes are related to each gameplay session, what happened in the session, how much did they report that they were having positive experiences, etc. And we had them complete a player experience of need satisfaction scale, the PENS scale. But the distal outcomes were really the ones that we're most interested in, which is also that basic psychological needs satisfaction and frustration scale, the children loneliness and social dissatisfaction scale, and the Kids Screen 27, which is a EU-developed health questionnaire for children and young people that looks at well-being along 3 different dimensions. And those instruments were reviewed and translated when necessary for cultural adaptations for the different countries and for the languages that the players spoke there. For instance, in Chile, we had our Spanish translators translate them into Spanish, and then the Santiago partners looked at that and said, that's not Chile, the Spanish we speak, right? So there are subtleties that we had, of course, the local research partners adjust. The results are that there's a significant main effect of digital play that we observed in South Africa only, where between the pre and the post-test, we saw an increase in well-being for those who played, but not for those who didn't play. So main effect in South Africa only. In the US and Chile, they were moderated by other variables. There's an interaction effect between some pre-existing psychological needs and gains on the specific domains of that scale. So where there was an overall effect in South Africa for everybody, well-being increased during after the 10 weeks. In the US and Chile, it was more nuanced. And what did that look like? In Chile, for example, there are more results like this. I'm just pulling out 2 of them. Those children who reported having greater feeling of loneliness and social exclusion, typical outcome, by the way, of COVID, as we all know, which is measured by that scale that I mentioned, showed significant greater gains in well-being in the autonomy and parent relations subscale of the scale. So loneliness and then well-being in terms of autonomy and parent relations. So you see the green lines are the gamers, the blue line is the control, and for them, the loneliness and the autonomy and parent relations, that scale improves, which in this case means it goes down. To give another example, for US participants, here again, the red line is the intervention group, the kids who played. Here we have autonomy also as an important outcome, where kids with higher levels of autonomy frustration predicted greater gains in the autonomy and parent relations well-being subscale. So it's not as simple as well-being increases in general. It's much more nuanced because it is a nuanced construct that for specific aspects of your well-being, like your need for autonomy, that is being improved by gameplay. And so the autonomy frustration goes down as you play more games. So generally speaking, we do not harm our children if they play the right games. And now we, of course, need to think about what the right games are. But I mentioned also that we're interested in the question of social play. And here we ran a social network analysis, and I'm just giving you the visualizations of those because the numbers are getting quite too many and too varied here to explain. But you see on the top left, that is the United States sample. Here we had one room in which they played, but different tables. And you see that even though you see clusters of tables, kids were playing with one another, and quite extensively so. You see the same thing in Chile, in School 1 and School 2, which of course we're not naming to prevent confidentiality and privacy of participants, but here you see in the different clusters, they also played with one another, but because they were different classrooms, they couldn't switch from one classroom to the next. The same thing happened in South Africa in School 1, but look at School 2, how much interaction there was, and that happens to be the school in the township that we worked with, where everybody was sitting around in the room and was constantly playing with one another. And in South Africa and the other schools as well, but again, two different rooms. The interesting aspect here is that we get asked a lot, why didn't you use multiplayer games? And the answer is we didn't have to. Kids make every game a multiplayer game if you let them. And game is inherently social. And so here's a beautiful way of showing that, but what's even more beautiful is that when we entered the scores from the social network analysis into this regression analysis here, we can show that there's more social connections made by children doing the gameplay, which comes out of the social network analysis, means higher predicted gains and overall well-being. So the more social they were, the higher the score in well-being that we found on the post-test. One other result that I wanted to highlight, and then I think I'm out of time, is that when we looked at gender, we didn't actually find all that much. But we found one very interesting thing, that girls who experienced higher levels of loneliness and social dissatisfaction, for them, more time spent playing video games was associated with higher levels of psychological well-being. That's an effect we didn't find for boys. Most of the other effects were for both boys and girls equally. We had some non-binary children in the sample, but not enough to make any statements about this, unfortunately. So, looking at all of this together, we can see that the results provide some evidence that digital gameplay can support children's well-being, at least from three different countries, that children use digital tools and digital play to meet very specific psychological needs that they have, especially connecting with friends, which then improves their well-being. It's also indication that the RightTech framework we developed for well-being can actually be used to develop well-being profiles in specific games. And we started, but clearly haven't finished, to work on design features for the game industry for children to allow them to make social connections and meet other psychological needs in order to enhance well-being. And with that, I think I'm out of time. And now I'm putting on my other hat. Are there any questions?
I don't know if I missed it or not, but why was it in South Africa that you were able to see such a dramatic increase in their social well-being levels?
It was generally on all scales of the Kids Screen 27 that there was a main effect. Why did we see it there and why did we see it not somewhere else? One possible interpretation is that the psychological needs there were generally higher. Okay. But it's hard to say. Bruce, would you be able to?
Yeah, their overall score was a little bit lower, so I think that's probably the biggest interpretation I would say, is that they had more room to grow.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering if that was it. This was my assumption, but no, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, Chile and the United States, especially in Santiago, it's a pretty, even though we tried to be in low-income neighborhoods, it was still, in comparison, pretty well-to-do participants. And so psychological needs often arise when you have other problems at home as well, like in the townships.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you have any kids in the group, and it seems likely that you did, who were neurodivergent? And if so, do you think the well-being framework is the same for kids with different neurodevelopmental conditions?
We definitely had neurodivergent kids in the sample. We are not allowed to ask about that though, certainly not for this study. Our human subjects protocol did not allow for that. Schools are not allowed to give us that information, generally speaking, so we could go through the parents, but that wasn't the main research question for the study, and we couldn't sample in a way that there were enough of them included to make it an actual research question. I mean, you have to think about this is the first study that certainly I'm aware of that looks at that scale, and for that we ask more general questions. Do I think, so we don't have any data that we could report, but do I think that the framework is different? I don't think the framework is different. I think the needs are different and the mechanisms are different. And we have worked on other occasions with kids on autism spectrum disorder and similar ADHD. We have kids like that in samples for our studies, but we didn't have them in this one. We didn't see anything.
No, just exactly what I was going to say. I think the overarching categories are the same, but how they get expressed and how you want to support it is obviously going to differ, not only just for neurodivergent kids, but for all kids, depending on their particular situation.
Okay, so then we have as our third